Welcome back to the Dear Global Leader podcast. I'm super happy to have a new guest today. So, this is Kasper Jelsbech. He's a PhD anthropologist, very rare to have this type of guest, but also a cross cultural leadership consultant at Implement Group. And you have worked for many years at the intersection between culture, leadership, and a complex international organization, all topic that I love. So, of course, this is the topic of this discussion, and we will have two parts. The first part will dig more into how cross cultural team and project can best together work and collaborate with your tool and your methodology of implement. And then we'll dive into your anthropologist lenses on communication, trust, and leadership. I'm super excited to have you here today. And usually, I'm always starting the podcast understanding what was the pivot that brought you where you are, because now we understood that you were an anthropologist and now you're a leadership consultant.
Yeah, so thank you first and foremost, Tiphaine, for bringing me on, for inviting me to your podcast. I'm thrilled and honored to be here. So thank you for that. Um, to begin with, I've spent a lot of my time throughout the years traveling, living abroad in various countries, pretty much all over the world, and I think having those experiences, both in terms of work but also just life, has first of all, for me personally, shaped me with a curiosity around understanding that there's so much more out there that we don't understand or see or grasp in our everyday life. We're surrounded by people who, for the most part, think like we do, act like we do, depending on where we're from. But there's so much more to it. And I think that too has led me with a sense of, I think, humility, in the fact that yes, I do have some perspectives and answers to some things, but it's certainly not the whole piece. It's a puzzle. It's a piece of the puzzle, um, and I think that's sort of my basic foundation. That's my outlook. That's how I view things. And of course, that led me to study anthropology, complete my PhD, and then for the last 9 or so years, working more practically as a management consultant. And the reason for that, I think, for those of your listeners who've gone through sort of academic training in varying degrees, they will recognize the feeling that academia, while interesting and explorative in many ways, can sometimes lack the gap to what we might sort of stereotypically call the real world issues. Like, how does this apply to people who work with these things on an everyday basis, right? And that's certainly something that I felt during my PhD studies as an anthropologist, that the thoughts and the questions that the research sparked, while highly relevant, sometimes lack the translation or the applicability, um, for people who work with these things, who work across cultures in real life. So that's why I decided to make the move to do what I do now, which is basically support, as you said, teams, leaders, organizations, to make those differences work, and really not just accept it and tolerate it, but really gain the benefits from the fact that we are different and we come with different perspectives and experiences.
Yeah, and I think it's really a loop moment because you were missing the practice and now you make people practice and also you practice through it. So it's very interesting. And in the podcast, we always look at the behind the scenes. I think it's exactly what you say. Sometimes you listen or I read a lot of books, and this is really insightful, inspirational, such as academia can be. And then you miss a bit of concreteness of what does it really mean. And so I would love that we understand a bit the playbook, and Implement is quite famous for their workshop and methodology. So I wonder, in your sector, if you could take one case or even one pattern, if you have a framework, and let us know what are your methodology to help cross-cultural team work together.
So I think what you mentioned precisely, and the reason why I'm at Implement is because the focus there is so much on how do we make this stick in the real world, our strategies, our ambitions, our goals, targets, our visions. How do we make those stick and live? when people operate in these systems. And I think that's the foundation of our one of our core beliefs, is that whatever we do, it has to work in a human system, right? Humans operate these organizations. Still, AI hasn't completely taken over, and still, humans will probably still be there, right? At least in the short term. But the point is, whenever we are dealing with humans, we are dealing per se with complexity. We are dealing with, ambiguity, with uncertainty, with multiplicity of meanings and so forth. And so what we do has to work in that context, in those complex systems, right? So I think that's the basic foundations of what we do. And that, of course, includes working with cross-cultural teams as well, as because that is the reality of many teams. And I think, unlike many other people-related topics that organizations can work with, I think the cultural dimension, the cross-cultural dimension, has this, I almost want to say, it has a visceral nature to it that make it more sort of deeply felt among many people, because working with others from different cultures, be it national cultures or perhaps corporate cultures, right? We can go into that distinction later on. It really confronts us with who we are as people, where we come from, how we do things, what we think of as right and wrong, our values. So it somehow exposes us to those deeply held beliefs about who we are and who other people are. And that's why when you work in a global team, a cross-cultural team of any sense, you're confronted with that, and that makes it very visceral. It makes it very real for many people, and for some also quite difficult to grasp with. So this is where we come in. We understand that this is the framework, or this is the situation, and for that reason, one framework, size of framework doesn't fit everyone. It is specific to the humans, the cultures that live there. With that said, I think when I look back at the clients that I've worked with, mostly there seems to be a methodology that tends to work quite well over time, which is, first of all, we need to have some kind of mirror. For any global team, you need to understand how do we perceive each other. So this is typically what we would do. We would have what we call a team mirror session. So, for instance, I worked recently with a Scandinavian company within finance, had divisions in both Romania and India, and of course wanted to strengthen the collaboration between these sites. And part of the sort of the methodology that we took was, first of all, exploring, okay, so the main office was located in Scandinavia, so we went there, but very cautious that this shouldn't be a Scandinavian-centric project, meaning, and this, to be honest, some of the people who reach out to us, they had this sense of, why can't we just get them to understand how we need to do things here? Which is fair enough.
It would just be copy paste, right?
If only it were so. If only it were so, right? But unfortunately, it doesn't really work that way if we want to really create that spark where we excel and we perform and we deliver. So what we do is we basically have interviews, we diagnose, we see what do people say, not just about themselves. How do we see us working out of, say, Bucharest or Bangalore, whatever, but also how do we see each other? And then when we have that conversation with the whole team, or at least the leadership within the team afterwards, we present them with not our sort of view on it, but each other's view on it. That is probably one of the most eye-opening experience any global team can have, because what they realize, and this is so central, they realize that my own perception of who I am and who we are is just my perception, right? It might be partially right, but there are other perceptions. And unless I start taking those perceptions into account, acknowledge them just as I acknowledge my own, I won't be able to function effectively within the team. So it starts there. It starts with that understanding of how we actually see each other. Then, of course, we need to have a shared language, a shared awareness of what does it then mean to work across culture? How do we communicate differently? How do we think about leadership and trust? These are issues I think we'll explore later on. And then, of course, finally, how do we then make sure that our communication runs smoothly and efficient so that we ultimately can perform and can deliver as intended giving our strategic priorities, which is, of course, always what we need to take into account. So we'll say that's sort of the process that any global team needs to go through, a kind of mirror exercise, having a shared language, a shared awareness, and then agreeing on, well, what are the cultural hotspots for us? It's not about creating a Scandinavian culture, an Indian culture, or whatever it might be. It's about creating a culture within those teams that work for the teams, right? And that's obviously something that people need to buy into. So there's typically a facilitated process as part of that as well.
Yeah, and I wonder if you can explain, because I follow you completely. I'm also working globally, so I'm day to day into this challenge, let's put it this way. Um, and this is also what I believe and why I created this podcast actually, because I believe that these skills is one of the top skills of the future, is that the world is global and we need now to adapt our mindset, our career, our stakeholders, and every soft skills, but also our skills into a playbook that is adapted to the global world. You see everyday people that are in this mindset, as you were saying, the Scandinavian team working well in Scandinavia. Why do they not want to adapt? That is work, we found it. So I wonder, with your experience, if you can explain why this work of collaboration of cross-cultural team is really key.
Well, I mean, I think first of all, it's it's a fantastic question. By the way, thank you for asking that. I think it's to many people and many corporations and organizations, it's central because it is their reality. Like they don't, sometimes I ask them, well, all right, fair enough. If you could wave a magic wand and make it disappear, you would only work in single country teams and setups. How would that work? And they sort of shake their heads because obviously it's a completely unrealistic scenario. It would never happen. That's just the nature of the world. So given that this is how reality is, we need to make it work. So I think it's one of those things that are not nice to have. It's just it's we need to deal with this. Now, interestingly, we are often called in after the fact. So it's typically when the performance breaks down, they stop delivering on the KPIs, friction increases, maybe even attrition rates go up, right? People leave and so forth. So that's when we are called in after the fact, and we sort of have to support them in getting the pieces back together. Wouldn't it be nice if we did that before it sort of it ruptured, right? So I think that's one thing. But again, the thing is that so I work a lot with sort of highly professional, sectors and industry. I work with professors and top researchers around universities around the world. I work with engineers, some of them leading industry companies and so forth. And what you see there, it's quite interesting. A lot of these people, the leaders and the team members, are highly qualified. And that's actually one of the biggest issues that they face is they tend to think of as a high performing team. It's not really about culture. It's about being professional. So they tend to disregard the culture because they are also professional and knowledgeable and experts, right? Which they are. But that actually, in my experience, tend to correlate with the fact that they downplay everything else, such as the culture and the way that they work. And that means they often misalign. They don't agree on how we should talk about our different ways of viewing things and so forth, because immediately we go into the subject matter discussions that we, of course, are experts in. And we tend to forget the cultural piece, which often, to many people's surprises, tends to be what makes or break a team performing. So I think those are some of the key reasons why this is important. It's the reality, and we often have this inbuilt idea that the more professional we are, the better we are, the more it is about competence, when in fact competence is rarely the issue. It's the culture behind it. And so we forget that discussion.
This is so interesting because culture is a glue. And I actually read something that is really, resonated with me. It was something about change management because our past guest was in change management. And it was something like people that resist the most to change are the one that build their identity into their expertise. And this is a bit what you say because I also reflected on my own, because sometimes you build yourself like a certain brand and certain expertise, and then you can fall into the trap that you become rigid because you have a certain views on the world, and then if someone comes with a new mind, you might stick to your idea, then maybe you say, I'm the expert, I need to take my stand on it. That's funny because I'm at that stage where I'm not anymore junior, I'm not too senior, and I'm at the age where I can fall into one or the other. Because I already see that before I was way more flexible. Someone had an idea, I'm the curious type, so yes, let's go. And now I'm a bit like, yeah, I need to think of the risk. So I wonder, it echoes a bit what you say. I wonder if you're called the most likely for younger team or any team, and if you can see if junior teams kind of work better with cross-culturality, based on your experience, maybe not on the studies.
Yeah, yeah. You ask deep questions. I really appreciate that. Um, I think there's a point to be made that with experience, perhaps our identity becomes more solidified in a sense. Perhaps that is what you yourself have experienced in different phases of your life, right? Which can create that sense of tension. Or we're sort of betwixt and between, right? Are we one thing or are we another? Or we somehow stretched between the two, and that can feel uncomfortable, honestly, for many people. People who work in global teams, especially leaders, will know this feeling intimately. Like they probably navigate it daily. So I think it's highly relevant. I wouldn't say it's necessarily, in my experience, correlated with younger teams versus more senior teams. I Because honestly, a lot of the times the teams that I work with, they're sort of mixed. There will be some people with less tenure and seniority, and some with more, and so forth.
Yeah, right.
Um, I I do feel that when I work with teams, it's very much operationally minded teams. They have to get stuff done, right? So why should we spend an hour talking about this? Well, the reason we should spend an hour talking about this, or 3 hours, or even 2 days talking about this, is for you to get stuff done, right? And that's what we need to sort of go back to. Is we all operate in a business world that is constantly demanding increased pace, to not be left behind, right? Our KPIs are pushing us, and there's all this sense of push. I would actually say, in terms of what can cause that sense of resistance that you also talk about, resistance to change, I wouldn't say it's so much about a person's experience or not. It also varies between individuals. It is perhaps more a systemic thing, which is something that we at Implement are also quite aware of when we work with any type of project. Is, well, we can talk about people and their behavior, but that only takes us so far, because at the end of the day, people operate in systems, cultures, and those cultures and those systems, they afford certain kind of behaviors. So if I do a training with a group of leaders around how do we communicate effectively, and I tell them, well, you need to take time to get to know each other and so forth, well, they might sort of scratch their head and say, that's fine, but how do we make that fit into the system? So we always have to think about what is the system geared towards, and how can we then navigate within that system, to make us work well? Because if we only focus on the individual behavior, we are at risk of not succeeding, because we forget the systemic aspect of it. So I think that's an important part, specifically talking about change and resistance to change. That resistance is often not people's resistance, it's often a systemic resistance to what we're talking about.
Talking about like different behaviors, I wonder, in a cross-cultural team, not everybody will react the same to a concept of a consultant coming and doing all this communication and trust exercise. And I wonder, how do you manage, people that get silent or disagree or conflict during this stage?
Yeah, I think there are different ways of dealing it, and also it kind of depends on the type of conflict that arises. Have you had experiences with those situations in global teams yourself?
Um, I need to say not conflicts, because I think also now that I'm in Scandinavia, it's also a culture that is quite, opaque to conflict. I'm French, and so I think that in certain part of the world, people are more passionate and more direct, and maybe it can feel to some people a bit more animated. But I don't think I ever had in the professional setting such type of conflict cases. I'm much more facing the silence, and I'm an extrovert, so sometimes a bit intriguing to me because you leave me a blank and I feel it. but I'm learning, to let the silence tells me the temperature of the room. But it's something that I've learned from working from different culture. For example, when I was in Asia, people will more and more get silent, and this can be disagreement, this can be conflict, depends on the country, and can be something different.
Yeah, okay, so a lot to unpack there. I think you're right. I think actually your experiences reflect mine. I rarely experience flat out conflict between people from different cultures in a session. When I do experience conflict, it is usually with people from the same cultural cluster, you could say, and by that I mean it could be the same country, it could also be the same company, right? But rarely between. The way you understand that there's conflict is when the communication stops, when they don't talk with each other. Then you know, oh, okay. So, like you say, it's the silence. It's the silence of not communicating. It's the silence of in-group communication, you can say, where people simply exchange ideas within their in-group, whoever that might be, right? That's when you know that you have that conflict. So it's what in the medical community you might call the Purgeon negative. Like you would expect there to be conflict, but it is there. Voicing disagreements. That's actually a healthy sign, I think, of any.
It's communication, right?
Yeah. They communicate. Obviously, you don't want people throwing stuff and leaving the room, but you want them to communicate, and in fact, you want them, and that's just for any team. You want them to disagree productively. But when that breaks down, when that stops, in fact, the absence of disagreement is the real problem. Because then you have to figure out, okay, so what's going on here? And again, I mentioned before that for cross-cultural teams, there's often this visceral dimension. There's like we are confronted with something that is deeper than just our professional competences. We are somehow confronted by who we are as a group, as a tribe of people, and who are the others, right? Who don't do things like we do. And so we are confronted with these very basic, sometimes slightly, primitive human tendencies we all carry with us, right? And so we need to have an eye out for that. So when that happens, if we could say that that's a type of conflict, what do we do? Well, the first thing I would say is to notice it, is to be aware of it, and then figure out, okay, so what, as you say, what might this be? Because silence can mean many different things. To give, a very mundane example, a lot of times I've spent time in meetings between, say, Danes and Swedes. I myself am a Dane. To some Swedes, the way that Danes carry out a meeting discussion can feel very confronting, even sort of almost assaulting like, because of the way that the discussion happens. But it's not necessarily perceived the same way from a Danish perspective. It's just, exchange of opinions, and that tends to be quite loud. Like you say, there are cultural differences to it. In some parts of the world where typically hierarchy is more present, you would always expect people lower in the hierarchy to stay silent. They would never speak up. And if they do, they would certainly be appointed and given the mandate by someone higher up in the system before doing so, right? So I think how we speak up and when we don't speak up needs to be interpreted into the local context in which we are in, without, of course, the stereotype, but cultural does influence it. So noticing it, understanding the context, interpreting it into its right meaning, so to say, will be key, so that we don't react. And for instance, let me give you an example. It would be very detrimental to my efforts as a cross-cultural facilitator if I notice that there's silence in a room, and then all of a sudden I point someone out and say, "You've been silent for some time. What do you think?" I might be violating a series of cultural norms and values in doing that if I'm not, some people call it culturally intelligent, if I'm not culturally sensitive enough to understand why this person is being silent. So I can really be like an elephant in a glass shop if I'm not aware of that. Another example, this was actually given to me a year or two back. I was collaborating with an Indian cultural trainer as well, and we sort of discussed how do we communicate, because we hear a lot from some of the sort of northwestern companies that both he and I work with, saying, "Oh, it's difficult. Why can't I get my Indian colleagues to reply to me on mail?" And we sort of discussed about this because we heard it a lot, and we said, "Well, what's going on?" And he had this phrase, he had this analogy he sort of used, which was interesting. He said, "For me, as an Indian person," he said, obviously not speaking for all Indians, but this was his perspective. He said, sometimes working with Northern European or Western colleagues can sometimes feel like it's a beehive. Everyone is buzzing around and, checking in and this and there, and they're impossible to catch and pin down. Everyone's buzzing around and being bee-like busy. And then he said, for me, I sometimes the Indian working culture, as he saw it, is more like a bird on a lake, right? It's there, it's still. But what you don't see underneath the water are the feet. You're paddling, like it's like we're moving fast and we're efficient, but it looks calm and serene on the surface. And he said, and that this is an interesting of just his analogy, but the point I think is interesting that he's trying to make is the issue, the error that we often make, all of us, I do it also, when working with other cultures, when confronted with those differences, is we tend to look at other people's behavior, how they do things, and then we interpret it through our own lens of what is right and wrong. Oh, so I see you're not replying to my mail. That must mean you're not taking me seriously or respecting me. No, it means that they will reply once they have an answer, right? Because that is the respectful thing to do. So I think this is where we often misalign with each other. We too quickly jump into assumptions of what the other person's behavior mean without taking into account their cultural assumptions behind those actions.
Mm. But beyond that, it's actually, I had the case just last week where I'm having like a new stakeholders. So of course I don't know them fully, and sometimes you make assumption, and then this person is in a difficult time at the moment because he has a lot of changes. So I was trying to not be overwhelming to him, but then I really needed an answer. So I text him on Teams, because for me, when I text on Teams, it's because it's more urgent than email, would be longer. But then he replied to me on email saying like, "Oh, I'm still missing this part." And then I replied to him, "Oh, I sent it on Teams." Then he replied to me, "Sorry, I don't use Teams. I use email for urgent asks." And then I replied to him, "Thank you so much, because now I really understand how you work." And I had that multiple times in my career where I thought, I wrongly assume that people will use the same tool as me for the same urgency or task. And then he gave me a hint. So now I know what best worked for him. Um, and I'm not sure if it's culturally or if it's individual, to be honest.
Thank you for sharing that example. Actually, if I can just if we can double click on that for a moment, because I think your example illustrates something that I see a lot in global leaders who are actually quite successful navigating across cultures. And it might be worth for your listeners to just reflect on that as well. A lot of the time, I meet sort of a concept, an idea around what is effective leadership across culture, what is effective collaboration across culture, and people tend to assume it is when I know everything about that culture, when I know the etiquettes and the do's and the don'ts, and I can quickly, in the heat of the moment, unpack why they do it, so I can quickly shift gears and I can change my communication in the moment, and these superhuman-like skills, which is I've been in this space 15 years, including my research, and I've yet to meet a person who does that. In fact, and here's the interesting thing, I would say the number one thing that makes leaders especially effective across cultures is not their superhuman knowledge around other cultures. It is the opposite. It is actually not knowing very much about it, but being quite clear about your lack of knowledge about other people, and having that sense of curiosity, that sense of openness, that sense of readiness to learn, to adapt, to shift gears. Because once you have that, in fact, some of the most effective leaders I've worked with, they are quite clear about how little they know about other people. Of course, prepare is always a good thing, and just you stay open, you stay curious, because then you can much quicker adapt. And as you say, which I would actually agree, I would actually think that the example you show could be an example of something that's not just individual, but might even be culturally, minded. Some companies work mainly with email communication, others work with Teams and so forth. So it might be individual, but it might, in fact, also be a cultural norm that we then, feel more aligned to. So I think that's a key sort of element to this. It's, forget about being an encyclopedic book or understanding or chat GPT like knowledge sphere of cultural differences. Just be open minded, be curious, and expect that other people will probably do things differently from you. If you have that mindset and are able to practice it, which is easier said than done, you will be far ahead of the rest.
Mm. And let's say if we had a leader, we don't know the seniority of the figure, but just it's the day one on the global project. So maybe he or she has a team. At least he or she has multiple cross cultural stakeholders. What would be an advice for this person? The first things to do.
The first thing you need to understand, and I use that because most people don't understand that unless they've tried it and they've failed and they've learned from that mistakes, because that's where most people fail. Most people tend to go straight into work. We sit down, we say, okay, these are the objectives, these are the ambitions, this is what we need to, these are the targets, go, go, go type of thing. Because that's the culture. That's the for many of us, that's the bee like culture. Fly around busy. Let's go, right? Um, Only to realize, later on, you might think that the meeting was effective because maybe it took 10 minutes less because everyone was silent and they understood you perfectly. No one spoke up. No one said a thing. Great, we're on the same page. You only then later realize that no one had no clue of what to do or why we were even doing this, and they're going in 10 different directions, right? And what we need to do, as I think leaders working with any team of some proportion of diversity, it could be from different companies, from different functional backgrounds, it could be from different cultures, whatever it might be. We need to take time to just understand who's in the room. And especially when we work across countries, in that sense, we need to understand, but also across companies, within the same country, we need to understand who are the people that I'm collaborating with. How do they see things? We need to be curious. And most importantly, we need to create the conditions for interaction. There has been a lot of research for many decades now looking at social stereotypes, what happens between the in group, the out group, us versus them. All of these very, again, visceral, fundamental human experiences when we come together in groups, right? Which happens also in the workplace. One of the things we can see is that there's a very direct causal relationship between people's sense of engaging with others, the amount of time we spend interacting with others, and the degree to which we have stereotypical ideas about them. If I don't interact with you, I might have an idea about who you are, but that's based on holes that I don't have in my, there's so much I don't know about you. So what does my brain do? It fills in the gaps. So that's where these ideas about who you might be, how you prefer to work, even based on slight anecdotal evidence that I've seen. Oh, I noticed that Tiphaine, she did so and so. That must be because she's so and so and so, right? The thing is, I don't know because I don't know you. So if you want a very effective, high performing team, people working across cultures, you need to start out getting to know the people you're working with and understand how they see things, how they collaborate effectively. That's annoying. And I know a lot of people will say, well, fair enough. Yeah, blah, blah. We've heard that a million times before. Then why don't you do it? That would be my answer to them, because I hear a lot of clients say that we know we need to do it. Well, then why don't you spend that time? And the reason why we don't spend time doing it is because innately, many of us see that as a waste of time. Why should we start out talking about things that are not quote unquote work related? This probably takes us into the discussion around how do we build trust with colleagues. But I'm curious to understand your perspective. Like, you've worked in different contexts and so forth. What for you has worked well and what has worked less well when building relationship with people who might be from different countries or cultural backgrounds than yourself? Do you have any sort of...
Yeah, yeah. When you say that, I was thinking back to myself, and now I'm thinking I didn't do it enough. But when I started to be very, very interested about culture, it's when I started to work globally, and I was doing something almost all the time when I was new in a team. I remember when I was in the US with the US Canadian team, I arrived and we were all in a room. I had to prepare a workshop. It was the first time I saw them of my life. And we actually did a bit of a test where you figure out where you are, and then we all discuss it. And we saw that some people were extroverts, some were introvert, some were acting this way. And then we use some skills, and basically we try to understand how we will react towards different situation and how we want to work together. And this was like so far my best functioning team, because it was also made very fun. We did, for example, the two truth one lie, to get to know each other a bit in the professional setup. And then we discussed also openly things that maybe created tension. We had sales guys that maybe took too much space, and then we had experts that maybe we needed to hear, and time to time they were passionate, and also time we didn't hear them. So it was a bit how we want this dynamic to work. Looking back, this was my best functioning team, and it's because, as you say, we took the time to get to know each other and build the team. And that's why it's super fresh to me. The person that worked with me, my mentor at the time, he had to leave for a plane. So we had a solo discussion, and I was trying to figure out, okay, what's the next move forward? And he told me, like, look, this is your team. Because before, this was a group of people. And after this meeting, this is a team. And this shapes something in me, because sometimes I look around and I see a group of people tied up together to do a work, and sometimes I see a team.
Hmm.
This is where I saw the difference.
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction. When are we working as a group and when are we working as a team? What's the difference to you? I'm curious.
What I saw happening in this room is that these people, they knew each other, and then maybe they work as a team without me, but then we found a way to work with me as a new piece in this team. And we found a way that everybody, not by role and responsibility, sometimes we do this exercise, and I think we should really go beyond. People assume that if you have a role and if you have responsibility clear, then things are handled. And this is not the way it is. We had to make each of the strengths make a puzzle, and that this puzzle makes sense for the common goal that we had, and we achieve the common goal that we defined. So we were a line of who was doing what, and also with who we were. And this created like a unicity and an energy, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing that example. That completely resonates, I think. And to give a sort of a meta reflection on what you said, I think a lot of times global teams can fail in how they frame the collaboration. If we say, all right, team US or whatever, we're going to collaborate with our team in, let's say, Brazil or Ghana or what do I know? Um, when we do that, and then we do the whole setup and so forth, when we frame it as such, we've already gone in my opinion in a direction that is less favorable, less productive for our sense of team, our sense of being, you know, fitted together pieces of a larger puzzle, as you so nicely put it. And the reason why that is, it's a detail, but it really matters, because if I frame you as fundamentally different from me from the outset, that will shape how I interact with you, and ultimately, it will impact the extent to which I think I can trust you. Again, I'm being misled by my own assumptions, stereotypes, biases, and so forth. But the framing that you and I are different to begin with, that is where we run into trouble. What we should do instead is we should say, all right, so we are going to work with a group of individuals from another country. We have no idea who they are as individuals. You might be French, but you might also have lived years in the US, or you might have lived in China or Vietnam. What do I know? And those experiences might have shaped you in ways that you're even more Chinese than other Chinese people, or you're certainly different from the stereotypical French person, right? And so there's no way for me to know that. So what I should do is I should start out by acknowledging the fact I'm going to collaborate with Tiphaine and maybe Andre and maybe Morten, whoever, right? As individuals, understand what are the two truths and one lie about this person. What has shaped their worldview. Over time, I can then start to understand how your cultural influences might influence you in ways, but it has to come secondary. It has to come as something that's after I know you as an individual. that is when the productive discussions come up, and we can talk about culture in meaningful ways, because now it's no longer something that tears us apart. It is something that we can explore with curiosity, because we already have that level of foundational trust between us as individuals. I think that example you just gave is a perfect, concrete illustration of that.
Super, but Luke, I think we already are going through the lenses of anthropology, so I think we will stop the part one here. So thank you so much, and we'll see the rest in the second part.